Hey everyone, this is George Gantz with Long Now Boston, and with me is Margaret Friedman. Margaret, do you want to give a quick introduction here?
Yes, thank you, George. I'm Margaret Friedman. I'm a regular board member of Long Now Boston, and it's my great pleasure to introduce a conversation, a very special conversation on deep time thinking with remarkable guests from uh, the West Coast of the United States and from London. Joining us from London is Richard Fisher, who is a journalist and former Knight Science journalism fellow at MIT. And he is author recently of The Long View, Why We Need to Transform the Way the World Sees Time, which was released in the UK last year, and it's due out in the US this year, this summer in paperback. We're also joined by Richard's friend and colleague, Vincent Ialenti. Vincent is a familiar face from a few years ago when he spoke to the Long Now and Long Now Boston. And we're delighted to have him back. He is the author of the book that came out in 2020 called Deep Time Reckoning, which was published by MIT Press. A quick note about our technical situation. This is the first time we've live streamed. We expect it to go swimmingly, but if there is a brief glitch at any point, please know that very capable technical people are on it and we'll get it back to normal as soon as possible. You've already met George. I think he has a few other announcements, but take it away, George.
All right, thank you, Margaret. I'd like to encourage people to use the YouTube comment function to communicate with us and with each other. If you haven't already, please post a note saying where you're coming in from, because we always like to know. And this is an interesting event because we're spanning the globe here. So let's see how far we can stretch that. So please let us know where you're coming in. The event is being recorded and will be released publicly on our YouTube channel after it ends. So feel free to share it with others that you think might enjoy it. I am a big fan of Long Now Boston. We're a gathering place for anyone passionate or even successful years of largely remote presentations. So we like to bring people together to build a community of long-term thinkers. And we'd love to have your help. Long Now Boston is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're 100% volunteer run and self-funded. The more people participate, the more we're able to do. If you want to help promote long-term thinking, please send a message to info@longnowboston.com or contact us through the website www.longnowboston.org, and we'll follow up. In addition to helping as a volunteer, you can also join as a member or support us with a donation through the website. Our first technical glitch is the microphone. I do that all the time, so we'll
Oh,
ask Margaret.
apologies.
Yeah.
Yes, first time for everyone. Um, we do also want to thank our corporate sponsor, Be Prescient, for its key support of Long Now Boston and our programming. Be Prescient is a creative force solving serious medical challenges through the application of advanced analytics and machine learning. Leveraging a unique and highly effective business model, Be Prescient has become a leading resource for life science firms trying to bring method, order, and insights to the growing flood of research and clinical data. Thank you, Be Prescient. And a quick note about our next event, which has finally become official and is very exciting. It's limited to only 25 participants, but we'll be doing a tour of the Deer Island Waste Treatment Facility on May 28th at 10 a.m. And this is a fairly sensitive security facility, so driver's licenses will be required in advance. If that influences whether that makes you more eager to participate or less eager, you can judge that, but it should be fantastic. Please stay tuned to the website and join our mailing list, and we'll see you very soon, we hope, after many more events.
Great, thanks, Margaret. So it's a great sunny, cozy Sunday afternoon, at least for me. I'm in Colorado. I don't know what the weather is elsewhere. It's evening for Richard in London and still morning for Vincent in California. So we're practicing multiple time perspectives today, even as we talk about the past, the present, and the future, and deep time. Many of us met Richard a few years ago in Cambridge when he was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow, researching the history and causes of short-termism, the psychology of time, and the long view of humanity and the planet. So I was thrilled a year ago when the book The Long View was published in the UK. He ordered a copy and devoured it when it arrived. Richard is a talented writer and storyteller, but it was his message about the acceleration of short-term thinking, why we need to change our temporal perspectives, and numerous examples clearly articulating how that can be accomplished that really resonated. So here we are. The paperback edition is about to be published in the US, and we're going to celebrate by at least trying to give away a copy to the first person who can answer a question that has been drawn from the book. So please post your answers in the comments. And Mary's monitoring the comments, so we'll see what the first correct response is to the question. So get your cursors ready to post your answer. It's a simple question. Who wrote the poem, "Forever is composed of nows"? So we'll wait and see. But in the meantime, Margaret, do you have that poem up? Maybe you can
Yes,
give us
I sure
a
do,
nice
and
reading of that.
I'm looking forward to reading it to set the stage for our conversation. Forever is composed of nows. 'Tis not a different time, except for infiniteness and latitude of home. From this experienced here, remove the dates. To these let months dissolve in further months, and years exhale in years. Without debate or pause or celebrated days, no different our years would be from Anno Domini.
That is beautiful. And somebody knows who authored that poem, I'm sure. But one of the things that pops into my mind is like telling us, okay, if you really want to pay attention to time, forget the categories we apply to it and the labels we apply to it, and, and experience it as it is. And that takes us back to, every moment is the same as the first moment. Right? So Anno Domini, the first moment of Christ, but really the first moment of creation. So it's just a really wonderful poem about expanding our consciousness. So waiting for a report from Mary to see if we've got a winner in the comment section. And I'm switching over to the comments myself. Well, we'll let that ride for a little bit. And now let's begin the program by bringing in our two guests, Richard Fisher and Vincent Ialenti, to the screen. This is where we're practicing some new skills. And Vincent and Richard, do you have an on-air live at the top of your screen?
I do indeed, yes.
All right. Richard, thank you. Excellent. This is great to have you guys as an experiment in our live stream, the first one we've done. So Richard, we've talked a lot since you were in Cambridge and a couple of times since then, and it's always great to hear that perspective. Now you've been working in this field of how to think about time and how to expand our consciousness of time for quite some time. When you were in Cambridge, you were researching your book. and you've done a lot of pieces at the BBC dealing with this thing. So just talk a little bit about what inspired you to get into this area and think about it, and what keeps you going.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here, and also thank you for asking a quiz question that I know the answer to in the book. Because one of the things about writing a book is that sometimes you've drafted the thing. I mean, I was writing this in 2018, 2019, and yeah, it's a long time between when you're writing it, when you're talking about it. But I know the answer to that question. So anyway, but yeah, on terms of where it began for me. I guess there were two starting points. I mean, on a practical level, when I was thinking about writing a book, one of the things my wife asked me at the time was, if you're going to take on a book project that you'll be talking about in 5, 6, 7, 10 years potentially, pick something that a topic that's always been there. And so I looked back over my life and thought, what was I doing as a teenager? And I was doing things like collecting rocks and being obsessed with geology. And so that kind of has always been part of like my interests in both of my having a rock collection, but also like my journalism, reporting on earth sciences and so on. But then beyond that, the kind of the trigger for thinking about the topic as a research area more seriously began with my daughter. In 2013, she was born, and in the sleep adult state that you are in when you're a parent, I started to reflect about her future and how long she might actually live. And I realized that born in 2013, there's a pretty good chance with medical advances that she'll see the next century. She'll be 86 or 87 years old, I think. And so when the fireworks go off and Auld Lang Syne is sung, she'll be a citizen of the following century. She'll be a grandma potentially, or great grandma herself, but she'll be there. And that kind of daydream made me think about future generations and how close we are to the future and the past than we might realize. You can do the same thing with your own family tree going backwards. You're just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Shakespeare or Dickens. Only a matter of generations away through your own family ties. And so I started to think about that. But then I also imagined, okay, well, my daughter might reach the next century, but then I thought about the date, 2100, and the way I report it in my journalism. It's very often negative. It's often sea level rise will reach this level by the next century. Robots will have our jobs by the next century. It's really rosy kind of milestones when you're thinking about the year 2100. And so that prompted a closer look into the issue of short-term thinking and how so many of our problems in the 21st century, climate change, antibiotic resistance, biodiversity collapse, growing inequality, all these are long-term problems, and yet we've never been so short-termist. And so I wanted to take a more rigorous approach. I spent some time at MIT and met many of the Long Now Boston people there, and try to kind of really understand what were the causes of short-termism, both in terms of cultural factors, but then also the psychological biases and habits that we have. And then beyond that, what kind of who is trying to think long term nowadays? And so that was the starting point, and it's been a fun few years since then, meeting lots of people who are thinking long term.
Is that how that started with you collecting rocks, is sort of connecting you with places?
Yeah, I mean, there's a story I tell in the book about something my dad asked me to do. This was when I was younger, but even when I was older in my adult life, before he died, he talked about like, well, when you go places, when you go to New Zealand or France or anyway, pick up a rock and I'll put it on my shelf at work. And so for a while, like he made lampposts. Worked as an accountant in a factory, and he had this like row of rocks from all over the world that I collected on my geology field trips and journalistic trips. But then after he died, I kind of remembered that he'd asked me to do that, and since then I've carried on doing it. So if I'm go hiking in the mountains, I think of my dad, pick up a rock, and for me it's a way of connecting across the generations. And also kind of enjoy my geeky love of geology, but when I pick up a rock, I also think of my dad.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's just really, really wonderful. All right, now, Vincent, You have been in this field of deep time thinking. You started in anthropology. That's your background and training. But what is it that draws you into this field and this conversation?
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. This is a really exciting forum. Glad to be back. Really enjoyed my time last time as well. I don't have kids. I spend a lot of time outside. I think that's more what draws me to it. I live up in the redwoods currently, for example. I recently went on a hike in Fern Canyon, for instance, in Redwood National Park, and that's a site that's been used as a sort of scenery for Steven Spielberg's Lost World, for BBC's Walking with the Dinosaurs, with IMAX's Dinosaur Alive. It's sort of this primeval, prehistoric area that I walked through. And I've been a hiker pretty much my whole life, since going back to a kid as well. When in my backyard, searched for salamanders and such, to connect it to what Richard was getting at. But when you walk through sort of sublime geophysical landscapes, it's hard not to sort of jump out of the sort of what Byung-Chul Han calls the age of haste, the restless whizzing of modernity. You see, for instance, in Fern Canyon, you see 325 million year old fern species. You see canyon walls that have been carved out slowly by this gentle trickle of a stream. You see coast redwoods, which have been in the region for almost 20 million years, and their relatives thrived in the Jurassic era, 160 million years ago. And all this, when you're outside, it feels like you're sort of seeing a portal to an earlier world. And you're seeing this sort of vast, unbroken chain of life. You see the dance of creation, you see the dance of erosion and growth and decay, and sort of the boundaries between your sort of landscapes of the environment around you and the landscapes of your thoughts seem to interface with each other a little bit. And it puts you in a different mood, it puts you in a different time frame. It creates a space where you can think big picture about your life and a little more holistically, and puts you in a place of not only tranquility and sort of communing with the now, as the poet said, but also with deep time at the same time, and geological time. I've always found that very inspiring. When I walk through the redwoods, I imagine Yurok villages a few hundred years ago with redwood planks sort of going around. Sometimes my mind goes further back and I start thinking about how these redwood forests are used to be all around the world, tens of millions of years ago, from Greenland to Alaska to France to Spitsbergen to United Kingdom to China. And it sort of connects you to what Kim Stanley Robinson, in his recent book, The High Sierra Love Story, calls psychogeology. I think it's an amazing term. And it's about going through landscapes and sort of reflecting on what sort of impact that has on you and how you perceive the world and what you feel and how you change. He talks about shifting into hiking's alternate frame of consciousness when he goes, and almost feeling smitten or in love with the mountains. And of course, psychogeology is a reference to psychogeography, which came up in the 1950s with the Situationists and Guy Debord. And it's about going through sort of urban landscapes in this spirit of interpreting and deriving and reflecting on your surroundings and seeing, so you can reflect on capitalism and modernity and the disenchantments of the modern age, etc. But I think there's no reason to confine that type of thinking to the city. It belongs in the outdoors. So I think that I study all sorts of things, nuclear waste. I've studied the clock of the long now. I've written about Pope Francis's climate change encyclical, all these different things. But the thing that always, I think, brings me back that is sort of the outdoor time, being timeful in geologist Mjøsi Bjornrod's sense. I think that's the root that keeps me going with this, even when I don't even have time for writing a second book. Like currently, I have my day job and I'm doing this on the side very much, this long storming book that I'm currently working on. Thank you.
Well, that's exciting, and it just draws me to the fact that you start with this local experience of being outside as a kid. You just liked being outside as a kid, and then something drew you into learning about the geology and the anthropology, the things that can kind of connect that particular space and time with a lot of depth, and the depth going back in time. So it sounds like that's kind of what drew you in, and you followed that into your academic experience and your professional experience, and now you're sort of you caught up in it. So I started with the little rocks and snails and and lizards or whatever it was that you were collecting as a kid, right?
Yeah, and yeah, it's a great place to do thinking. Hiking is the best place to think. Airports are also good because you're in between places and you're not captured by either place. You're kind of in transit. You're in this non-space or third space or but yeah, outdoors has always been great to think with, and I always sort of wondered why. And increasingly, there's a vocabulary for describing that through terms like timefulness, or many of the sort of long view lexicon that Richard introduces in his book.
So these the things that you both express about what you've drawn you into this area. We have a culture and a society that doesn't seem to be going in that direction. It's very different than what you describe as your experiences. So I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit first, about short-termism. What is it? What do we experience today? And maybe how we got here. Richard, you want to start with that? You talk about that a lot in your book.
Sure. So I tried in my research to try and identify some of the reasons why culturally short-termism might have developed, because whilst there are psychological habits, which the famous marshmallow test, that kids are asked to do, that kind of can encourage us to go for short-term over long-term, that there's also many societal, cultural factors, inventions that have, I think, fostered the kind of the short-term mindset. So we live in a time where there are myriad incentives and deterrents that exist within all sorts. I mean, whenever I talk to somebody about their kind of their work, often they say, oh yeah, I work in medicine, or I work in business, or I work in politics, and all of them can identify the kind of the stresses, the things that keep you trapped within the now. The most famous is the quarterly report, which Long Now Boston will be well familiar with, but that way that leaders in business have to kind of report back to the market every 4 months. That's an example of something that hasn't always existed within trade and business. It was invented as a practice. I think the New York Stock Exchange started doing it, requesting it of companies about 100 years ago, and then it was kind of formalized in the late 20th century. But that way of asking companies to do that doesn't necessarily need to be there. I mean, there were good reasons for shareholders to get reports every quarter, but one of the things that the people who've researched it have found is that it does change people's behavior. Like leaders are. There's a chap at City University in London called Arthur Kraft, who looked at like two different factors. He called it myopia and discipline. And one of them is that if a business leader does something that kind of is longer term and displeases the short term investors, they get punished. That's discipline. It's bad for their prospects as a CEO if they do that. But then there's also kind of the self inflicted kind of short term thinking, where the boss of the company, she decides to do something that will please the market without even finding out if it will be good or not, and cutting R&D because their expectation is that the short term will be pleased in that way, and so that's in business. But there are in all sorts of other industries there are these incentives and deterrents. And so I think one thing I think about in my own industry, journalism, is the way that journalism is incentivized to focus on the present. I spend quite a lot of time on Twitter, or X, but which I probably shouldn't do. I try and kind of think about like how, if I'm a journalist cultivating a kind of longer view, how should that be reflected in the work that I do? But so much of the news industry now is focused on the past 24 hours or even shorter timeframes. There's very rarely kind of like coverage of the long news, things that have got better or worse over a very long time period, things that are moving too slow for the kind of the daily TikTok of a newsroom to pick up. So I think these incentives and the deterrents that exist within culture, they're there. They're not necessarily easy to fix. If there was a silver bullet, we would have fired it. But I think that the thing that kind of gives me optimism is that we don't need to design our systems and our societies in this way. There are ways that we can root out the reasons that short-termism has come to be so dominant.
Let me ask you to just, it's 2024, so a lot of people might not really have the visual about what the metaphor time-blinkered originated in. Do you want to cover that? Go back before the term of automobiles in London or New York, and all the horses and carriages floating around, and and the horses are spooky. They, if they respond, they'll react and stuff like that. So what did they put on the horses?
I'm not sure how to answer that, George. Like, I mean, I guess. Oh, sorry, the blinker. Right, I got it. I think the reason I use the term time blinkered in the book is that I wanted to come up with a term that captured the idea that we are not just focused on the short term, but we're coming more blind to and blinkered to the whole arc of time. I think because short-termism describes kind of like foregoing kind of long-term benefits for short-term upsides, whereas I think if you can go slightly beyond that, you can think about, if you think about the long arc of time and our role within it, there's all of history to learn from, and there's all of a future that's still to come, and that reorientation of our perspective of time is something that I wanted to do within the book. Show people that if you're long-minded and you see where you fit within this grander story of humanity and the earth and where it's headed, then there's a lot of benefits to be found. There's kind of hope and meaning and perspective. You can see more clearly what matters in the present. Because I mean, sometimes people say to me, like, okay, well, mindfulness is about the present. That's a good thing though, isn't it? Right? You should be mindful. And that's seen as a kind of like healthy thing to do. And so I mean, so there's a bit of a kind of contrast there between should I be short-termist or should I be present-minded? And I think so time-blinkedness is harmful short-termism, harmful present-mindedness. Sometimes we do need to be present-minded. There's serious problems that the world faces that we need to tackle right now, and there's also kind of the upsides of life, all the joy and happiness that you can experience as a human being in the present. So you should be mindful of that. You shouldn't be thinking about the far future at those points. But I think being aware of like our broader position within time is something that I was keen to emphasize.
Yeah, that's excellent. We Bina Venkatraman was a speaker with us a few years ago, and I think the title of that was called, how do you make long-term thinking a short-term priority? So it's a little bit that same concept of, here we are.
I've lost George.
Yes, I lost him as well. I thought it was just me.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like it sounds like what George was going for was what remedies or techniques we could look to for escaping the tyranny of very short-term focus. I'm kind of curious to know whether you've found that people who are in a situation where they have more discretionary time, do they actually use that time in any way to focus long term? For example, the older population or inmates, for example, who have fewer obligations right in front of them, who might, I just wonder if you've looked at that at all to see whether there is a tendency when there's more discretionary time to use it in any way that's a little bit different, temporally thinking.
I guess, are you asking kind of like if you slow down, is it easier to see?
Yeah.
Like, I definitely think there's something to that. There was a paper that the philosopher Paul Cilliers, I think, put out a few years ago that was about the importance of a certain slowness. And in it, he argued that slowing down allows you to kind of expand. And it used the metaphor of a motorcyclist. I think it was from a novel Milan Kundera wrote. If you're on a motorcycle traveling at 80 miles an hour, all you can focus on is the road in front of you and nothing else. You're not going to be reflecting on the trees as they pass you, or you're certainly not going to be thinking too heavily about deep time. If you did, you'd fall off your motorcycle and not concentrate. So I do think like speed and pace is a factor, a psychological factor. The faster we move as a society and as individuals, the harder it is to stand back. And it goes back to Vincent's point about nature. I mean, I totally agree. That's a time that I sometimes find to slow down and pause and step out of social media. What's your own view on that, Vincent?
Yeah, thanks. Discretionary time is an interesting framing. Another framing I see sometimes is time poverty. The idea that, opportunities for reflecting on the long term or engaging with planetary time aren't necessarily available to everyone equally across society. For instance, if you're disabled or you can't go on these hikes through the Sierras and see what Kim Stanley Robinson saw, or just what I described. If you're born blind, like what I just talked about, you have a different experience of it, number one. Also, people just living a different time frame, like living paycheck to paycheck, or struggling with trauma or mental illness, or working multiple jobs, facing housing insecurity. They might lack the leisure time necessary to go out and do this. So it becomes an idea of how are time horizons distributed across society, or accessibility to time horizons. It also raises the question of why do we conserve outdoor spaces? One reason is natural resources. We need trees to build houses and make paper. We need trees because they're beautiful and they're charismatic, and there's all these charismatic ecosystems that we can enjoy for recreational purposes and leisure. But if you don't have that leisure time, you can't go out and sort of be timeful is whenever you want. Also raises the question, right, of the people who do have leisure time and do have this discretionary time. Are they actually, as you brought up, Margaret, are they actually doing this, right? Is it so? If you were to take the people who are time impoverished right now and then give them sort of time subsidies, would they go out and use that to engage with deep time in the way that we're advocating in this column? Not quite sure of that. I don't know the answer to that question, but it does bring up the idea, an interesting idea of conservation in general, which is, we conserve for charismatic species, we conserve for charismatic ecosystems and natural resources, but also what about conserving for, these are places that connect us to the longer arc of time. Like when I go out and camp on the ocean, I go to Mattole Campground often in the Lost Coast up here in Northern California, and you see the stars. You're connected to cosmological astronomical time. You see sort of the bluffs and the erosion and the different pacing that goes on there. You start imagining yourself the thought experiment Richard brings up in his book is the Millennium Man. So I think that was developed in the 1800s, who would see our whole world as just a quick flash, versus the Minuteman who lives his entire life, in just a minute, would see our world as completely static, right? So you start playing with these there's something about these outdoor landscapes that almost entices or elicits or draws the mind to start having these discussions, these psychogeological, timeful moments. So I think going outside is the way to get out of it. Not everyone has equal access to this type of experience, but we should also start thinking about conservation through a new way, which is this is access to a place that entices you to think longer term and resist shallow time discipline, the term I use in my book, resist chronophobia, which is Marcia Bjornrud's terms, resist time blinkers, Richard's wonderful term. Or another one that kind of uncovered recently is tempocentrism from Margaret Mead in the 1970s, this hyper-individualistic sort of fixation or rootedness in the present moment and inability to think outside your tempocentric sort of time-bound mental strictures. So it can help, I think, to go out and do that. And thinking about the redistributive and structural questions is important too.
I think that point
and
you
it
made
looks
about
like George is back.
Yeah. Hi, George. Oh, well, I was just going to pick up, what Vincent said about like how, I think like standing back and thinking about deep time sometimes can feel like a luxury, right? Or I think if you if you are struggling to make ends meet, it's difficult to think, okay, well, why should I think about deep time or geology or a clock of a long now? And I think my own kind of conclusion after researching in the book is that there are many different routes to the long view. And there's many different practices and approaches that don't necessarily. My own perspective is kind of scientific because I was a geologist as an undergrad and a rock collector, as we know. But that scientific perspective on deep time is just one of many. There's people who approach it through art or through family, or philosophy or religion, and these kind of like a different long views. I think the long view is plural. It doesn't necessarily need to be just a single way of thinking about geology and time. In many ways, people were thinking about the very long term before the concept of deep time was even discussed. It's a relatively new term. I mean, it was mentioned in the literature, but like it was John McPhee in the 1980s who really popularized it, and geologists themselves didn't realize that the Earth was quite as old as it was until the 1700s. And so I think there's, when I think of like ways to approach the long view, I think for me it's geology and family, but there's many different routes to the same kind of destination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm touched by what you were saying about the, sort of the immediacy drawing us in, so we get stuck in that immediacy, and that actually reminds me of the session we did with on long-termism with Professor Kiran Satya of MIT, and his own struggles with pain. He has chronic pain, and part of his philosophy comes out of understanding that the pain grabs your attention, really grabs your attention, and it's hard to focus on something else. And I think what we're talking about here is, okay, so the stresses that we're inflicting ourselves, or culture's inflicting us with, or technology, the stresses that we're feeling is helping to draw us into the immediacy of the now and the short-termist mindset. And some of the things that you're talking about are unlocking that through meditation, through nature, through exploration of science, a discipline of science, to unlock that sense of stress and the immediacy of the moment that gets us stuck in the moment, so that we can kind of expand our consciousness. It doesn't make the stress or the pain go away, but it just changes our consciousness of it. Is that a good characterization?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I know Kiran Satya too. I met him when I was in Boston, and he writes a really he writes beautifully. I would really recommend his book Life is Hard, and I think he's also written some interesting critiques of long-termism as well. In Boston Review, I think he wrote that was a good piece. So yeah, I think there's definitely something there. But yeah, I mean. Sorry, go on, Jeff. Yeah.
Well, if you want to, Vincent, you want to chime in about that fact that we're kind of stuck in the stresses of the now and we have to find a way to release it?
Sure. I talked a little bit about being outdoors and timefulness, etc. There's a powerful line in Richard's book, that stuck with me. I wrote it down. It says, history shows that people's perceptions of time have changed before, so there's no reason that they cannot transform again. I think that this is really crucial. It reminds me a lot of the late anthropologist now, unfortunately, David Graeber, who wrote a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, long-term thinker himself from a very different perspective. And he says the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something we make, and we could just as easily make it differently, right? So I think that that's kind of an interesting space where anthropology and long-term thinking come in to sort of challenge short-termism, because when you imagine a far future world, or when you imagine a world in sort of a distant ancient past, you're kind of imagining the world otherwise. You're kind of distancing yourself from the present pain or present excitements or present sort of rush or frenzy. And you're sort of denaturalizing your surroundings in a certain way. And when you do that, it can sort of spark creativity because you're taking a little mental time travel. The poet Arthur Rimbaud had turned the term, read Robinson Crusoe, and then started using Robinsonaire as a verb for mentally wandering or mentally time traveling to different spaces, constructing these little theaters in your minds of different points in time. And when you do that with long-termism, or long-term thinking rather, you sort of are challenged to see the world otherwise. You're challenged to imagine political systems being different than they are, cosmological systems different than they are, metaphysical systems being different than they are, languages being totally different than they are. And you're forced to sort of imagine yourself in a world that's completely different. And you start thinking about the art of the possible in the current moment, of how dramatically different the world can be now. So I would agree that if people are feeling caught up, I'm reminded of, I briefly mentioned it before, but there's a book called The Scent of Time by philosopher Byung-Chul Han, which talks about an age of haste that we currently live in. And people have lost sense of being part of an arc or part of a larger narrative history. He says the story of history has lost its scent. It's lost our position. We just whiz from place to place and sort of collect imageries and along the way, and then death comes before we know it because we're rushing so much. And the art of contemplative lingering, he calls it, and sort of peacefully slowing things down is being lost. But when you start with something hopeful, like what Richard says about, we've seen all these different time views, to use his terms, across millennia. Why can't we expect a different time view will be coming soon? In fact, it would be naive to assume that this is the end of history when it comes to time views, when all we've seen over and over again is time views changing dramatically over time. So there's something very hopeful about that. And I think I really appreciate the kind of hope-fueled path to the 23rd century that Richard lays out in his book.
Well,
what do you think, Richard?
With the time views, one thing that makes me reflect about it is that it's thinking about like how time in many senses is a cultural construct that we that lay our metaphors and lenses on top of. And to give you an example, I don't know if you're the same, but when I think about time, when I'm passing through it, I'm imagining myself within a landscape, and time is in front of me, and the future's in front of me and the past is behind, and I'm walking towards the future. Or sometimes it's, time is on an x-axis. If you're thinking scientifically, it's on, runs from left to right. However, there are cultures that have the opposite orientation, where the history and the past is in front of the eyes and the future is behind the head. And so you're walking backwards into the future, which, when you think about it, actually makes total sense. That's how it actually is. So you can see the past, but you can't see the future. And so I think that makes me consider, okay, well, the way that like time exists out there in the world in physics is there potentially, but like the way what we do in our brains to kind of navigate through it is cultural, and that can change.
Speaking of culture, I am very curious about. Oh, sorry. I'm very curious about the growing acceptance of psychedelics and the effects that those have on some of the problems with breaking out of short-time thinking, and whether either of you are following the sort of diminishing controversy. And I'm a little bit aware of my background here on the screen. It's I was not making a reference to this in the background, but the fact of sort of melting boundaries, and apparently many people have time traveling experiences with drugs. Arthur Rimbaud, the poet, of course, was a heavy drug user, and I just wondered, if those folks were consciously trying to overcome their own inhibitions about time, and perhaps their own hang-ups about mortality as well, which can keep them down.
I can answer that one if you want. I work for BBC.com, and we've run a few features articles about psychedelics, and like one that comes to mind was written by the journalist Rachel Neuer. She wrote a book that came out recently called I Feel Love, and it was about the science of psychedelics and MDMA. And the particular story that she wrote for us, it wasn't about time, but it comes to mind because she wrote the story of a guy who was a white supremacist and then participated in a kind of a trial, a scientific trial, and it completely changed his worldview, and he turned away from these beliefs. And it was a case study and anecdotal. It wasn't necessarily kind of saying psychedelics will do this for your worldview, but it was an interesting story that showed potential. I'd recommend going reading it, read all the nuance behind it. I guess I'm also interested in kind of like psychedelics at the moment, because my next book hopefully will be about the sublime and the modern sublime, and often sublime experiences are associated with these drugs. And I think that if you can access the sublime, that certainly can be world changing too. But yeah, I haven't found a case of someone whose world view of time changed through psychedelics, but I'm sure they're out there.
I think of it as associated with shamanic cultures, where time typically is nonlinear, and so it might be pretty closely associated. Thank you for the recommendation. Great.
Can we take us just a step back to you mentioned Karen Sataya when he was on. He was talking about that critique of long-termism, and let's talk a little bit about long-termism as I think, Richard, you talk about that a fair amount in the book in terms of the usefulness of being able to expand boundaries of the way we think about ethics and morals, and to expand it from this time-centered, it's only what we're thinking about now, to a much broader sense of, well, what about the future humans? And that has a value in terms of expanding our horizons. But I think one of the critiques that Karen put forward is, I'll just paraphrase it very bluntly by saying that the philosophy seems to be sterile. It's about these numbers, and you compare the numbers of trillions of humans in a million years, and you say, well, what do a few lives today matter? And it doesn't really attach to the human condition of the human heart or the human experience. So useful, but you spent some time on long-termism, and maybe you could just talk about it again here for us.
Sure. Yeah. I think about these things a lot. So for those who don't know, like long-termism is a type of long-term thinking that's emerged in the effective altruism community, and it began with the perspective. So effective altruism about 10, 15 years ago, they started to think about, okay, well, how can we do the most good? And so many of the first kind of interventions and recommendations that came up through this kind of philosophy and movement were focused on the developing world. So, for example, if you want to donate money to a charity, effective altruists argue that you do better by donating it to buy a bed net in the developing world, rather than kind of like give money to your local charity. You'll be more likely to save a life eventually if you do that than if you kind of give money locally. That then changed, because then the temporal kind of lens came in. So it's like the argument started to emerge within these communities that, okay, well, if I'm going to donate money and start to think about like how I spend my career and try and do good with my life, I can save trillions of lives in the future if I prevent existential disaster happening. So if I stop AI from taking over the world or causing nuclear Armageddon, then 100 trillion people could come to exist that might not have otherwise existed because of extinction. And so it is, as you say, it's a numbers-based argument. Often it's kind of like taking a top-down view of thinking about all of humanity who are alive today, and then all of humanity who might exist in the future. And then to an extent, kind of putting them on scales, saying, okay, there's 8 billion people today, but there's 100 trillion who could come into existence within the next million years. that's a lot more people than today. So if we weigh their total needs, and then this is where like Satea's like, you know, the philosophical stuff comes in, because it's a kind of a utilitarian argument. It's kind of about the greater good. The greater good is served by like looking to the long-term future and trying to kind of tackle their needs rather than ours potentially in the present. I mean, that's a very kind of crude way of putting it, but that's kind of the one way of looking at it. So it's not my own perspective. I guess one thing to know about it is that there's different flavors of it. Sometimes the critiques that you read online are often focused on quite the extreme end of it. So there's two different types of long-termism. There's weak long-termism and strong long-termism. You know, there's other types of there's patient long-termism, broad long-termism. There's other flavors, but the weak and strong are the ones to know about, because weak is kind of like the closest to like the long-term thinking that, you know, we think about in this kind of community. You know, just thinking about it being a moral priority that we think about future generations. It's one of many moral priorities that we have, but there are other ones as well. Strong long-termism is more extreme. It's arguing that it's the number one moral priority of our time to make sure that the lives of future generations go well, and it supersedes everything. And so you can, it exists on a spectrum. And so when you're kind of reading about long-termism, I think bear that in mind. It's definitely not for everyone, and I definitely think it's one of many time views. It's not something that I can totally subscribe to myself, but I do think there are interesting ideas within it about thinking about our place within the human story. You can directly contrast it with the situated generational view of a duty to posterity. I mean, that's very much the seventh generation principle, or Edmund Burke talking about society being a contract between the dead, the living, and the people who are to be born. That's thinking about you and how you connect to generations. Whereas long-termism is the kind of the big view of like all of humanity. And so it leaves some people cold, to be honest. And that said, it also inspires lots of others. So I definitely think it's an interesting kind of like time view.
Yeah. Could I add to that?
Please.
Yeah. I mean, I've been reading it. I've encountered folks who have taken strong long-termism to heart, and landed in some strange territory where you start getting like, oh, climate change, we can brush that aside because, you know, even if 50% of people died in the long arc of history, we're like cockroaches, we'll come right back. Or, hey, you know, why would I invest money in, you know, helping the homeless? You know, I live in California, so this is a very trenchant issue over here. Increasingly, especially in LA, there's, you know, 66,000 homeless people. So why would you invest in that when you can invest in sort of building planetary, you know, give philanthropically to building a planetary civilization and or bring generative AI and push things forward. There's this idea that like, why privilege a simple human life that's not going to change the larger arc of history? It gets pretty disturbing quick for me. So that's one element, but the weaker versions of the long term and make a hell of a lot of sense to me personally. But they're sterile, as you mentioned. It would be a shame if that effective altruism, sort of utilitarian, mechanistic, counting widgets version of long-termism were to not be situated in a wider ecology of time views, as Richard does in his book. For instance, you know, it doesn't even make sense to a lot of different cultures. If you go to Aboriginal Australian traditional cultures, there's this other temporal realm called the dream time or the everywhen, where people go to, and it has totally different temporal conduits to it that keep it going, right? Like if you go to, we opened up with talking about deep time is in the now, or eternity is in the now. There's an old theological book called The Eternal Now by Paul Tillich, about how communing with eternity always happens in the now, but also, you know, that's another time view, right? Or the idea that eternity from Boethius, right? From medieval times, right? Or where the transition from Greco-Roman to medieval times gradually led to this idea that eternity is all the time bound nows at once. So everything occurs at once from the eternal time frame, but, you know, all in sequence from the temporal time frame here on Earth. So some of these are scientific, some of these are not scientific at all. Some of these are theological, some of these are in some people's superstition, but what they do is they give us a wider vocabulary of seeing the world from a variety of different standpoints, and getting one sort of master narrative or one master sort of framework that you can apply to everything, this sort of economistic, professional managerial widget counting, and then say, logically, you should donate your money here. I think that that's one perspective, a valuable perspective among many, as long as it doesn't go too far. There's even some thought experiments that say once we all enter the metaverse and there's, or there's millions and millions of consciousnesses inside the world of AI, and we're giving them sort of like positive utility and helping them and making them happy, is that increasing the amount of happiness in the world? Because we've created these like virtual avatars that we then make happy, and therefore you can count widgets all the way into infinity. I mean, there's some strange places that type of economistic reasoning can go. So it doesn't appeal to me as an anthropologist. It appeals to me as one of many perspectives, one of many time views in Richard's terms that sees that today.
Let's change topics a little bit, and Richard, you were talking earlier about the ways in which capitalism can go wrong with short-termism, and then the internet and social media is all about eyeballs, and so we all get caught up in this process, and the incentives are driving us in our institutions in that direction. But you both are familiar with some institutions and cultures that have temporal intelligence and resilience that are part of their their DNA and the reason why they survive for long periods of time and do. So I wonder if you could just use some examples that are the positive side of cultures and institutions being able to think and live in a deep time perspective that allows for survival and resilience over a long period of time. So, Vincent, you had experience, and that was the topic of your first book, right? The whole experience of the Finnish sighting of long-term nuclear waste repository. So that was characterized that way, right?
Yeah, that's it's my bread and butter, my radioactive bread and butter. Yeah, it's I mean, that's an organization in Finland. So for context, as George mentioned, I spent 3 years in Finland. I conducted 120 interviews among folks building what is now going to become the world's first, most likely going to become, pending regulatory approval, the world's first deep geologic repository for spent nuclear fuel. Of course, spent nuclear fuel has, plutonium has a half-life of 24,100 years, and hundreds of millions for uranium. And so they're building this facility, and they're creating these 10,000-year models of 6,000 future people living in the region, going out and then sort of walking and collecting food. And they're also creating models of 14 different types of radionuclides escaping from the repository far in the future, where they're going to bury the spent nuclear fuel, and going through pathways up through groundwater channels and getting released at various points on the surface. And then they actually simulate people sort of like picking up the food and seeing if it's below regulatory dose limits as this sort of a time model perspective. And it's a really powerful thing. They plan to iterate this safety case that they're developing. I was there looking at the construction license safety case around 2012, 2013, 2014, but now they're working on another iteration, operating license one, and they're going to keep iterating. They've really started this, depending where you count the start, as the 80s or the early 90s. And they're going to keep iterating new sort of higher resolution versions of Finland's far future, going 10,000 years in the surface and hundreds of thousands of years in the hydrogeological realm below the surface. And they're going to do that until 2120 or beyond, when it's time to decommission the facility, which is really quite a long time for contemporary, planning horizons, when you're used to sort of the boom and bust of startups and other businesses. So I was immersed in an organization that has this multi-generational continuity time horizon, and their task is to imagine the world 10,000 years in the future, to think about how our present day wastes and discards will affect people then. Incredibly important place to look. And the big takeaway is, like, we don't have to really speculate in a purely philosophical mode. We don't have to start from scratch. There's blueprints, there's heuristics, there's frameworks out there being developed in these tiny corners of the world for building the type of societies and type of institutions that do think long-term and have this kind of slower mindset. One of the most powerful parts of Richard's book, for instance, was his discussion of Zoroastrian priests lighting fires, the Atash Barams, the victorious fires. And some of those will go for 1,000 years, some say 1,500 years. There's no way to prove that the fire went the entire time, but there's something inspiring about the continuity of skills and being transmitted across this community of practice in this ritualistic fashion, that it keeps going and going. Even if the fire went out historically at some point, what's continued is the practice of keeping going, right, and enduring. Same with the Issei Jingu Shrine in Japan, which has been rebuilt 66 times, and there were, as of about 100 years, 90 or 100 years ago, they planted cypress trees to plan for the next time they'll rebuild it. It gives this sacred responsibility, these through lines that are passed down through the generations. It creates this kind of like social glue across generations to a handoff. It sounds different than nuclear. It sounds different than nuclear waste, but it's a similar process. It's planning in long scale timeframes and paying extra attention to archiving and databasing and tacit knowledge, handing down of sort of experiential, sort of lived experiences and skills. So people report a lot of testaments of elders in nuclear industry for the young generation. There's a lot of mentoring and sort of ensuring redundancy. There's a close attunement to a lot of the things involved in these other case studies of things that lasted a long time, like Japan's Kongo Gumi Construction Company, which has been around since the 500s, or University of Morocco that's been around since 859, or other contexts like that. A hospital in France has been around since 651, kind of kept going, and is the Long Now Foundation's organizational continuity project had shown us. There's loads of organizations, pubs, wineries, chocolatiers, insurance companies, financial institutions that have lasted a really long time. They seem to have a similar DNA at some level if you go broadly enough. And that's where it gets really interesting. So we have some case studies from which we can, and exemplars we can build future societies based off of out there today. We just have to figure out what the special spice is and pull it all together.
Yeah. Thanks, Vincent. I mean, Richard, I think he's read your book.
Yeah. Thank you, Vincent. That's very generous of you. Just to add to that, I think one of the things that I've come to the conclusion is that if you want to make something last, you need a community. If you want to think long view, it's easier to do so in a community of people like this, for example. But I mean, to add to the list of examples of like cultures and institutions that think long term, one of the things I've engaged with quite a lot since writing the book is a network of long term art projects that is building. So the people behind the Letters of Utrecht, which is in the Netherlands, which is a kind of multi-generational artwork, a poem that's being written into the streets, one letter at a time. A cobblestone gets carved every Saturday, sponsored by a member of the community, and then a new letter gets put in. I think Long Now sponsored the first letter, as far as I know. Anyway, one of the co-founders of that project has tried to bring the other long-term art projects and artists from around the world together in a kind of community network. And so you've got the Time Pyramid in Germany, where a community called Vending is building a kind of pyramid over the next 1,200 years. You've got the Future Library in Oslo, which is a kind of Katie Patterson founded, where every year an author submits a new manuscript that no one has read and no one will read until the year 2114. When they'll be printed on on paper growing in trees in a forest north of the city. So all these long-term art projects like have community attached to them. The Future Library has a community around it. But, I went to the ceremony in 2022 where the manuscript is handed over, and the authors went into the forest with Patterson but then a whole entourage of people who just came from the local area in Oslo, who with children on their shoulders and dogs walking along into the forest to see this manuscript handed over. And that sense of community and ritual, I think, is more likely to make something last. I would say, if you, I mean, you can build something that you want it to last a long time and think about materials and where you put it and is it going to flood, and maybe I should use ceramic ball bearings rather than steel. But I think the likelihood of something actually sticking around, we'll have people who care about it. And I think that multi-generational endeavor in many of these art projects, many of the things that Vincent mentioned, that's always there.
Yes, I'm struck by the difference between something like long-termism, which is this entirely intellectual kind of exercise, and these art projects, which are reaching people at some different kind of a level of consciousness, through emotion, through community, through something novel and different and unique that they feel like they can belong to. So it sounds like these are popping up, and lots of people are trying to move along those channels to develop long-lived institutions, and using some of the examples of the ones that we already have been there for a long time.
Yeah, and I would say if anyone watching or listening is developing some kind of long-term art project or culture, then to get in touch with the Michael Munker, who kind of oversees the long-term art projects network. They're definitely looking to expand.
Yeah, this is a little bit of an offshoot, but we think about long-lived art projects like the Egyptian pyramids. We have a grandson that's absolutely completely fascinated with right now. And then you go and think about the cathedrals in Europe that took hundreds of years to build. Obviously, the masons that worked on it, the work outlasted their own lifetimes. And the mosques and palaces and throughout the world that are based on religious traditions and principles. So there was something long-lived in the fabric of those cultures, and in at least some of those cultures, it had to do with death, or the mystery of life, or the religion that binds people together in the face of the unknown. So is this? Well, let me put it this way: how do you think, from a long-term perspective, do we hold the concept of our own death? That's if you're a long-term thinker, Richard, I see you smiling. So it's
no, because I thought Vincent was going to take the death question. I could try. Yeah, it's
again if you want.
I can try. I mean, I definitely think it's daunting to consider, like, how your life is just a brief flash of sunlight on the surface of a pond, and then the pond or the lake is just going to carry on without you. I think that is a kind of a chilling thought. I mean, but I mean, to return to the concept of the sublime, I guess that the sublime is both dread-inducing but also awe-inspiring at the same time. And I think that mixture of emotions is where you're kind of thinking about your own kind of lifetime and your legacy to the future. I think that can be both at the same time. I think we need a bit of the sublime in our lives from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Vincent.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it too, now that I'm thinking about it. So it's interesting that when you extend your mind remarkably across time, like into these deep time horizons, across the millennia, there's different paths it can go through. There's a book called Awe by a psychologist, Dr. Keltner, that just came out, which sort of focuses on sort of a more positive twist on that, which is, it can kind of help you overcome mental blocks and see the world afresh and become more collaborative, less egoistic. You feel like you're part of this larger tapestry or this larger sort of global fabric. There's universal fabric. It makes you more altruistic, more open to social connection by positioning yourself in this larger frame, by feeling sort of like small. And so there's a way to look at it that's not just nihilism, that's not just everything doesn't matter, this is just a blip. A powerful point in Richard's book, again, yes, I just read the book to get ready for, because I was excited for this event. So powerful thing in there is, if you go back across time, another sort of uplifting, sort of integrating thought that happens is, you go back to the generations, you have your parents, and then you have their parents and their parents and their parents. And eventually you get to a point where there's no longer Homo sapiens and there's no more Homo sapien parents. Eventually you get to a point where there's not even anything recognizably human. And eventually it's simple celled organisms. And eventually you're just primordial nothing, and we're continuous with non-life. You get back to non-life eventually because we emerged out of non-life, the inert, and that's where we go after we die, right? We become inert again. So there's something about this that I think Brian Eno has actually written a bit about this, about like or talked a bit about this in relation to sort of music for airports and sort of ambient music. Feeling that you're part of this wider fabric makes you a little more comfortable with your own death and something like that. It's a way to become at peace with it a little more. On the other hand, there's other ways to go with it too, of course. I'm a social scientist, so I can't help think but of Emile Durkheim's 1897 book, Les Suicide, which actually talked about concept he called infinity sickness. And this is the sort of gloomy perspective on stretching the mind across time. The idea that if you a brush with infinity can well up mystery and meaninglessness, anxiety, overwhelm. And he says there's two ways people become sort of suicidal and alienated through this sort of way. One he called infinity of dream, which you're just so caught up in your own ruminations and your own sort of like, what's the point of all this sort of existential crisis, your own smallness, what's the point? They kill themselves. The other way is infinity of desire, where you lose your ego the other way, which is extending. So you want to do everything because you know your life is so finite, and you want to go out and sort of explore and see everything and do everything, get everything on that Instagram and do everything on your bucket list. And then you commit suicide because everything's meaningless because you've lost yourself externally rather than internally. So there's so many different sort of like psychological directions the question of death can go to. And actually about a year ago, or no, this is about 2 years ago now. Time flies. It was part of this podcast called Long Time Academy, hosted by Ella Saltmarsh, and there was a death doula named, I think, Alua Arthur, who was on the call with us. It was Brian. This is featured me walking the host through an imagined sort of nuclear waste repository in the year 2120, and we're walking down and we're talking about deep time and long-term thinking and how spent nuclear fuel can sort of inspire us to think about positive and negative ways as we go down. And at the bottom, we meet an indigenous knowledge systems scholar. We meet Brian Eno talking about ambient music, and we meet an indigenous knowledge systems scholar. We meet geologist talking about timefulness. And when we're down there, the death doula talks a little bit about how living life with death in view is a way to live more meaningfully. Also, it's a Heideggerian point from the philosopher Martin Heidegger of being unto death. But going through your life knowing that it's finite is a way of living the most meaningful, authentic, and free life. So she kind of walks people through that process and saying, like, any amount of time I have now can be made more valuable by knowing that it's finite, because it's now a finite resource, a scarce resource that I need to make the most out of. And it can be connected to long-term thinking and through all these different pathways. So,
yeah, that's fascinating.
I guess I did have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm reminded that, I was in the college in the early 70s, and the Carlos Castaneda books were popular, this sort of spiritualist influence. And one of the mottos from that was, death as your advisor. You keep death on your left-hand shoulder or your right, I don't know which, but you keep death as your advisor about guiding you. And so, but it does have both the positive and the negative quality. If you get hyper-focused on that thing, it can be pretty depressing and can lead you into some unhappy places. But if you are able to absorb that, it can be a way of opening up to much bigger perspectives, going forward. So this is, somewhere deep in everybody's heart, as they're all dealing with time issues and life issues and how we make meaning, there's that question of mortality, and in some sense, if we are able to tap into that with time perspective and understanding of our, we are stardust ultimately, and we are going to be stardust, and we don't know if maybe there will be trillions of humans out there across the universe in the future. We're part of that. So finding a way of creating a narrative around that is maybe a way of helping people draw into these concepts of of deep time thinking and be able to then change the way we approach the now. That was great. Thank you.
And perhaps
It really reminds me of, yeah, if I can just add,
Vincent, go ahead.
please. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. So yeah, you're starting to remind me of sort of Stoic philosophers from Greco-Roman times, like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, talked about meditation in a way that's very differently than we see it today. It doesn't have to be all about wellness. It doesn't have to be about transcendence or spiritual anything. But they saw it sort of as a future acting way to prepare yourself for negative events. They'd encourage people to meditate on lousy things happening, like worst case scenarios, and imagine yourself in that scenario. If you want to do the mental wandering to the bad future, and then realizing that in that scenario, I'm still sort of okay and things are fine, and I'm gonna, so you've already lived the worst case mentally before it comes physically. So they'd always encourage people to put themselves and imagine their reaction strategies, their arguments, their ways of getting out, their ways of coping with it. And so sort of meditating on these things as a way of releasing fear from them. And I guess death could be one of those things. But it has a very long tradition going back to the Stoics, which is interesting.
Yeah, our grandkids, we're reading a book the other day. It's called "It Could Be Worse." So that's the "It Could Be Worse" philosophy. So let's take a little time to try and sort of wrap up. Collectively across our world, our culture, the work that you're doing, the work that others are doing. What are we learning about the importance of having time fluency, deep time perspective? Are we making progress?
I would like to think so. I mean, it's I guess I can give a more personal perspective. Just the trajectory of thinking about these things over the past few years has given me a sense of perspective, hope, meaning in ways that I wouldn't have had otherwise. If you're, I mean, if you live in the world today and you only read the news every day and you digest everything that was on Twitter, it can feel like the world is getting worse and the world is awful. And it's certainly true that there are some really troubling trends that are fostered by short-term thinking. However, the long view can give you a different perspective on things. It can show you how far we've come. That there are many things that are better today. Modern medicine is a lot better today than it was like 100, 200 years ago. A lot more people have long, flourishing lives as a result. It's definitely the case that we have made progress as a species. It just happens slowly. And so that, hopefully that gives me hope that there's more progress to come. The long view though also shows you that there's much more work to do. If you look ahead to the future and then think about like the lives of our children and the hopes that we have for them, then it's definitely not a fixed world by any means. So that for me is the main kind of benefit of the long view. It gives me a sense that it gives me clarity about what matters now, what I need to do, and how I need to think. And the relationships that I foster, the work that I do, that certainly, that clarity and agency is something that's what I get from it.
And Vincent.
I think it's possible that progress is being made in some domains and then it's going the reverse of progress in other domains. So I would say it's both and. There's some progress here, some lack of progress over there. One thing that struck me though, to try to make this go full circle, is when you do spend time outside, right? Like going to the question of time literacy, and you're doing this kind of psychogeological pondering. Like I went to Eastern Nevada, and when I was in Eastern Nevada, I found myself near Mount Washington, kind of close to the original site of the Clock of the Long Now, and you see this 13,000-foot summit, these limestone cliffs that are, from the Precambrian age or the Cambrian period, 560 million years ago. You see there's trilobite fossils out there. There's bristlecone pines that live, for over 4,000 years. There's ancient clonal aspen groves in the area that kind of replicate over extremely long periods of time. There's a melting Pleistocene glacier. There's cave paintings from indigenous people from 3,000 years ago. There's like a mine shaft. There's actually something called the Forgotten Winchester, right? So this rifle from 1882, found leaning against a tree. They found it again in 2014, loaded, sitting exactly where it was. So you're in this landscape, and I'm appreciating the temporal immensity of this landscape, and all the different interleaving, sort of interfolding long-term timeframes. And it's sort of helping me take a step back and find space for thinking in big picture, holistic way. But to your question, there's a roundabout way of answering it, is why was I able to notice all those things in the first place? Well, if you take a long view on why I was able to notice all those things in the first place, it's because information is accessible and cheaper to get. I just have to go on my phone or on a computer, and if I can't afford one, go to a library and then get internet access and learn about all those things, and then go on hike, basically. So the capacity to, there's been successes. We fixed the ozone layer significantly. There's population stabilization. That's some other good news from deep time. But there's also just little things like the capacity for us to be timeful and do this kind of long-term reflection that I'm advocating in this book that I'm developing called Long Storming, is largely an effect of the dissemination of information and and misinformation, sadly, but more affordable information too for more people, and the sort of democratizing of this information to allow people to experience deep time in a way that's not just reserved for sort of aristocrats, naturalists of the 19th century, or the Darwins of the world, or the Lyells or Huttons of the world. So I think there's progress in that sense, of the fact that it's at least accessible to a lot of people more than ever. But is that what people are interested in? I don't know, but I hope so. Mm-hmm. And I think that work like Richard's book and other books that have come out recently can help us get us there. But we're still a time-bound society, for sure.
And so, last question is, what's a recommendation you would give to all of us to focus on how do we change our perspective? How do we change ourselves? What do we do to support this nascent developing movement of time fluency and deep time considerations? You've already made several suggestions, so it's just kind of a little opportunity for a wrap up. And Vincent, we'll start with you, Vincent, because I think you were the one that was talking about the, get out in nature, right? That's part of it.
Right, that was one. That's an easy one. Get out in nature, armed with information about the landscape, and then ready to think and not escape from the world, but to engage with the world. So yeah, like in a more sort of like holistic, creative way. I would say just imagination has to be essential to it. The German philosopher Hans Weihinger wrote a book called The Philosophy as If. And that's sort of celebrates the fictions you create in your mind, the sort of quasi-true, quasi-factual fictions about the future you create in your mind. They're props for navigating an uncertain world. They're props for cognition. They help you think and push your thinking forward. And rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater with the parts of them that are sort of seem frivolous or seem so speculative to the point that they seem impossible, just embrace those, because those are the ways out from the world. So spending time outside and not being afraid to do some creative, imaginative brainstorming after lots of rigorous sort of like data collection and information collection about the longer world around us. Yeah, that would be my takeaway of what we all individually could do. Great.
So Richard, turning to you.
Yeah, taking a cue from Vincent's work and writing, I think I kind of learned this from him. Like the deep time in the everyday is there if you go and find it. Yeah, I mean you can go out to the countryside, of course, like Vincent's mentioned, but it's in roadworks, in like the tarmac of a geology space. Like you can start to see like down through many layers. Vincent writes about like going to Washington DC and thinking about like how it was once a swamp with cypress trees growing, and I've since tried to integrate the everyday deep time into my own life. Richmond Park, which is near where I live in London, like has these barrows which are kind of like Bronze Age, 4,000-year-old kind of culture. Like, you know, I walk past it regularly, and I never would have known it was there if I hadn't taken the time to look. Or there's a kind of care home near where I live, where there's a time capsule buried outside, and a little sign in a bush that says, like, this, when the building was made, like, someone planted a time capsule here. And I've got no idea what's in it, but I just like the thought that someone thought to leave something for future generations for it. So, you know, the deep time every day is there if you look out for it. And if that doesn't work, then get a rock collection, like I did as a teenage boy. I've got a fossil here. The best fossil I ever found in France on my dissertation, like geology kind of undergrad. Like I found an ammonite that is about that big, which I would not have found if I was not looking for a rock to bring home for my dad. So yeah, I definitely would recommend having some kind of geology nerd out when you can.
Oh, that's wonderful. This has been a great conversation, very serious and hard work. And I just want to make sure we end it on a lighter note, you know, for all of us deep time thinkers. You know, we ought to be thinking about up there, you'll see that poster. It's an invitation to the greatest party of all time, scheduled for June 6th, 2269. So we have a lot of work to do between now and then, but by the time we get there, it's going to be a heck of a party. So I'll just leave it at that. By the way, I know you, Richard, you know Mike and Pete that have put together that interesting thought piece about a way of approaching the future with a little bit of fun. So thank you both very, very much. This has been an awesome experience. Thank you. Turn it back over to you, Margaret.
Well, that was indeed marvelous. I am absolutely exhausted by the realms you two opened up, and George as well, to thinking. This was really a heady conversation. We're thrilled that you were able to be here and lead us through this terrific maze of issues. We'd also like to thank our technical director, Gary, who has kept us live despite some obstacles, and also our comment juggler, Mary, who has been passing along the few comments. I will say that one person commented about the Australian it was the Australian pitch drop experiment. She was the only one who mentioned a particular experiment that illustrates things. But anyway, I hope very much that everyone will visit our website and stay in touch on social media at Long Now Boston. And we look forward to sending you more information about the upcoming events and seeing you as soon as possible there. So many thanks to everybody for being here. That is all for now, and thank you and stay well. Bye-bye.